Anchoring bias. Anchoring bias happens when the very first piece of information you receive becomes the anchor for all later decisions, even if it's irrelevant. Imagine you're negotiating for a car. If the seller starts by asking $15,000, that number anchors your thinking. Even if you manage to bargain down to $12,000, your brain feels like it's a good deal, even if the car's real value is only $9,000. Anchoring doesn't just happen in shopping. In courtrooms, initial sentencing requests can sway judges, and in everyday life, first impressions often set the tone for how we perceive people. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, and recall information in a way that supports one's pre-existing beliefs. If someone believes left-handed people are more creative, they will notice and remember instances that confirm this belief, while ignoring or dismissing evidence of right-handed creativity. This bias is especially powerful in politics and religion, where people selectively seek media that reinforces their worldview. On social media, algorithms amplify confirmation bias by feeding users more of what they already agree with, creating echo chambers. Overconfidence bias. Overconfidence bias refers to people's tendency to be more confident in their abilities, knowledge, or predictions than is justified. For example, when asked trivia questions, most people will state they are 90% sure about their answers, but in reality, they are only correct about 60% of the time. Status quo bias. Status quo bias is the preference to keep things the same rather than change. In experiments, people were more likely to stick with a default option, even when alternatives offered better benefits. For example, many employees stay with their default retirement plan, even when switching could give them higher returns. Status quo bias plays a role in everything from politics to technology adoption. It explains why many resist change, even when change is clearly beneficial. Actor-observer bias. The actor-observer bias describes how we explain behavior differently, depending on whether it's our own or someone else's. When it's another person, we tend to blame their personality or character. But when it's ourselves, we point to the situation or external circumstances. For instance, if a coworker misses a deadline, you might think they're lazy or they're not good at managing time. But if you miss a deadline, you're more likely to say, I had too many unexpected tasks, or the instructions weren't clear. The bias comes from perspective. As actors, we see the challenges in our environment. As observers, we only see the behavior, not the hidden pressures behind it. Hindsight bias. Hindsight bias, also known as the "I knew it all along" effect, occurs when people see past events as more predictable than they actually were. After a football game, for example, fans often insist they knew which team was going to win, even though before the match their predictions were uncertain. In medicine, hindsight bias can distort doctors' evaluations of diagnoses, as outcomes seem obvious in retrospect. This bias is dangerous because it makes people overconfident in their ability to predict events and less likely to learn from mistakes. Self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the habit of attributing successes to personal ability and failures to external factors. If a student aces an exam, they say, I studied hard. But if they fail, they blame the teacher or the unfair test. Athletes credit victories to their skills but blame referees or bad luck when they lose. Framing effect. The framing effect shows how presentation influences decisions. The same fact can sound very different depending on whether it's framed positively or negatively. For example, people are more likely to choose surgery when told it has a 90% survival rate than when told it has a 10% mortality rate, even though both statements are mathematically identical. Governments and advertisers exploit this bias heavily. Policies described as tax relief sound positive, while the same idea framed as tax cuts for the wealthy can trigger anger. False consensus effect. Humans have a natural tendency to believe that their personal opinions, beliefs, and behaviors are shared by the majority. This is called the false consensus effect. People overestimate how normal or common their own views are. Psychologists first identified this in the 1970s, showing that when participants expressed a choice or belief, they almost always assumed most other people would choose the same. For example, imagine you're someone who always recycles. Because recycling feels so normal to you, you might assume that nearly everyone else also does it. But in reality, recycling habits vary widely, and your assumption is more about your own perspective than about actual statistics. The bias works in reverse too. If you don't recycle, you may assume most people don't care either. Bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect describes people's tendency to adopt beliefs or behaviors simply because many others have. It's closely tied to social conformity. In politics, voters are more likely to support candidates who appear to be leading in polls. In markets, people rush to buy trendy products not because they need them, but because others are doing it. The bandwagon effect can also spread misinformation, as repeated exposure makes false claims seem more credible. Illusory superiority. Another powerful bias is called illusory superiority, sometimes known as the above-average effect. This is the tendency for people to believe they are better than average in skills, intelligence, or morality. Of course, by definition, not everyone can be above average, but this bias is remarkably persistent across cultures. Classic studies show that most drivers rate themselves as safer than average. Most students rate themselves as smarter than average, and even prisoners often rate themselves as more moral than the average person on the outside. The bias exists because our minds highlight our strengths while downplaying our weaknesses. Frequency illusion, or Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. The frequency illusion happens when something you recently learned suddenly seems to appear everywhere. You encounter it once, and then you start noticing it repeatedly, creating the illusion that it has become more frequent. Suppose you learn a new word, like serendipity. At first, it feels rare, but over the next week, you notice it in books, in conversations, maybe even in a podcast. In reality, the word isn't appearing more often. Your brain has simply become sensitized to it. Availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where people judge the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. For example, after seeing multiple news reports about plane crashes, people start believing air travel is dangerous. In reality, commercial flying remains one of the safest forms of transportation. Because dramatic events like crashes or shark attacks are more memorable, they dominate people's risk perception, even though everyday risks like car accidents or heart disease are far more common. Representativeness heuristic. This bias occurs when people judge probabilities based on how much something resembles a typical case, instead of using actual statistical logic. For example, if you meet a quiet, bookish person, you might assume they are a librarian rather than a salesperson, even though salespeople vastly outnumber librarians. This is called the base rate fallacy, ignoring the actual statistical likelihood. Representativeness can also fuel stereotypes, as people rely on surface similarities instead of deeper evidence. Fundamental attribution error. Fundamental attribution error is the general tendency to overemphasize internal traits and underemphasize situational factors when judging others' behavior. Imagine you see a parent scolding their child in public. You might quickly conclude, that person is harsh, or they must be a bad parent. But what you don't see is the bigger picture. Maybe the child had been in danger, or the parent had an extremely stressful day. The attribution error happens because it's easier for our brains to assume a fixed personality trait than to imagine the invisible complexity of a situation. Sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is when people continue with a decision simply because they've already invested time, money, or effort into it, even if walking away would be the smarter choice. Psychologists explain that this happens because humans are loss-averse. We hate the idea of wasting something we've already spent, so we let the past dictate our future choices, even when it no longer makes sense. A simple example is buying a movie ticket. Imagine halfway through the film you realize it's terrible, and you're not enjoying it at all. Rationally, you should just leave and do something better with your time. But many people force themselves to sit through it, telling themselves, I already paid for the ticket. The money is gone no matter what, but the sunk cost fallacy makes people endure a bad experience rather than accept the loss. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos to explore more about psychology and human behavior.